So the last question on your research methods section on paper 2 could be asking you to design a study. So there's a lot of different things that you might be asked to do here. And they might ask you for specific things. So it's a really tough question because it's asking you a bit to think on your feet. Do you know how a study should be conducted and what's involved in designing a research study? So if they give you set things you've got to talk about, you've got to talk about them. If they don't give you many guidelines, then you've got to be able to include a lot of the things that we talk about in this video. There are other things you could bring in, but this will give you a good solid basis for writing this answer. So, things we're going to look at: the design, the method, the variables, the materials, how you're going to control variables, the procedure, the sample, the hypothesis and analysis you might use, and also ethical considerations. When we're talking about experimental design, you need to firstly work out what you're looking for. Are you conducting an experiment looking for a difference, or are you conducting a correlation study looking for a relationship? So you need to make that clear first of all. Also, what experimental design are you going to use? Repeated measures, independent groups, or matched pairs? Usually they'll tell you which one you're going to use. And a lot of the time they'll tell you repeated measures because they want to see, do you know whether you should use and include counterbalancing later on in your experiment. With the method, you've got to make it clear about how and where you're going to obtain your data. So are you going to use an observation, content analysis, self-report, so interview or questionnaire, etc. How are you actually going to get your data? For the variables, you've got to know what are you actually trying to measure. So you've got to operationalize your variables. You've got to be really specific. You can't just say, I'm going to measure aggression in the playground. You're going to have to mention, I'm going to look at punching, kicking, etc. You're going to have to operationalize those variables. Okay, be really specific about how you're actually going to measure and test what you're looking for. Also, are you going to do any experimental tasks? Is there going to be any testing involved in it in order to work out what the variables are? For materials, what are you actually going to require to run the experiment? Be really specific. Are you going to need crosswords? Are you going to need pencils? What are you going to need? Stopwatch? What are you going to need to run the experiment? Remember, it needs to be in enough detail so someone can replicate the experiment. When we talk about control, it means what variables do you have to control in your study? So you need to make sure you've got standardized procedures that control certain variables straight away. Are you going to have to counterbalance your experiment? Remember, that's a key word that you might need to go back and think about. When we were doing repeated measures, you've got to counterbalance your experiment to stop order effects. Random allocation, are you going to use that? Why are you going to use it? How are you going to stop things like investigator effects? Are you going to use single or double blind studies? How are you going to control for variables? Don't just put the normal standard thing like I'm going to control for age, for gender. Make sure you're linking it specifically to the experiment. For procedure, it must be a standardized procedure that every single participant in the experiment follows. And it must be replicable. Someone must be able to take this and conduct the exact same experiment somewhere else. That's the level of detail they're looking for. For your sample, from whom will you be getting your data from? Okay, what sampling technique did you use? Volunteer, opportunity, Stratford. What did you use to get your sample? And who is your target population? Where are you getting your actual participants from? When we talk about hypothesis and analysis, what do you actually predict is going to happen? What would be your hypothesis for this experiment? And also, what are you going to do with the data? We've already looked at statistical tests. So based on the data you're going to get, you know how the study is being run, what the experimental design is, if it's repeated measures, etc. What are you actually going to do with the data? What test are you going to use to analyze it? And also, we've got ethical considerations. How are you going to make sure your participants are treated in an ethically acceptable manner? So you need to think about all those ethical considerations: informed consent, debrief, and all those other ones we've already discussed in previous videos. Which ones are going to be most important for your study?